For most people who grow up in the United States, the question of where the family actually comes from tends to arrive only in fragments. A grandmother's offhand comment about a relative who fought in some old war, a yellowed photograph with no names written on the back, a surname that nobody in the family can quite explain the origin of. Most of these fragments go uninvestigated for an entire lifetime. They sit quietly in the background of family identity, treated as folklore rather than as the kind of question that could actually be answered with evidence. But for a small and steadily growing number of Americans, those fragments turn out to be the visible tip of something much older, much deeper, and considerably more documentable than anyone in the family ever suspected. A line of descent that reaches not just into the 19th century and not just to Ellis Island, but all the way back into the 17th and 18th centuries, into the earliest English, Dutch, French, and Scottish settlements that would eventually become the United States. This is not a fringe question confined to genealogy enthusiasts and historical societies. According to research conducted by Ancestry DNA and widely cited in subsequent genetic genealogy analysis, a majority of white Americans today are descended from colonial-era settlers, with the large majority of those colonial ancestors having come from Britain, and most specifically from England. That is a striking statistic, and it means that the question, could my family actually trace back to colonial America, is, for an enormous number of people reading this, not a hypothetical at all. It is simply a question nobody has gotten around to answering yet, mostly because the colonial period sits in a uniquely difficult zone of American record-keeping, too early for the dependable censuses and vital records that genealogists rely on for more recent centuries, but not so early that the paper trail vanished entirely. Professional genealogists who specialize in this period will tell you plainly that the records exist. The challenge is knowing where to look and recognizing the signs that point you in the right direction before you even begin. This puts colonial genealogy in a strange and somewhat paradoxical position within the broader field of family history research. Most people assume that the deeper you go into the past, the harder a family becomes to trace, and in a general sense, that is true. But colonial America occupies an unusual middle zone in the difficulty curve. The earliest years of settlement, Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, the founding of Massachusetts Bay, New Amsterdam, and the other initial footholds, were small, tightly organized communities precisely because survival depended on close coordination, religious record-keeping, and the careful allocation of land. Town founders kept rosters, churches kept membership rolls, courts recorded who owned what and who owed whom. It is only in the centuries that followed, as the population expanded and record-keeping became simultaneously more bureaucratic and more fragmented across an expanding frontier, that some of the easier, more centralized records, like uniform civil registration, actually disappear for a time, only to reappear in the 19th century in a different and more standardized form. In other words, colonial ancestors, once you know how to find them, can sometimes be more thoroughly documented than ancestors who lived a full century later. The signs below exist because that paradox is real, and because recognizing it is often the difference between a family history that stalls out at we think we might have some old American roots, and one that produces an actual, sourced, generation-by-generation lineage. What follows are 7 of the most reliable indicators, drawn from genetic evidence, documentary record patterns, naming traditions, and the institutional structures that colonial-descended families have built around themselves for more than a century, that suggest a family may have roots reaching back into America's colonial period. None of these signs, taken alone, constitutes proof. Genealogy does not work that way, and any serious genealogist will tell you that conclusions built on a single piece of evidence are conclusions built on sand. But taken together in combination, these signs form exactly the kind of pattern that professional researchers look for when they take on a new client's family history. And recognizing them in your own family is very often the first step toward a documented lineage that previously existed only as rumor. The first sign, and in many ways the most immediately accessible one for anyone curious enough to look, is what a commercial DNA test's ethnicity estimate actually shows once you understand how to read it properly. Ancestry DNA and similar testing companies calculate these estimates by comparing a person's DNA, broken into thousands of small segments, against reference panels built from the DNA of people with long, well-documented roots in specific regions of the world. The resulting ancestral regions come with assigned percentages and can reach back more than 20 generations, which for most family trees means reaching well past the point where any paper record survives. A result showing significant percentages from England specifically, as opposed to the broader and less informative Great Britain category that lumps England, Scotland, Wales, and the Isle of Man together, is one of the more telling signals Because England was overwhelmingly the dominant source of the earliest colonial settlers in New England, the Chesapeake, and much of the rest of British North America. It is worth being careful here, because ethnicity estimates are a famously imprecise instrument, and genetic genealogists are unanimous in warning against treating any single percentage as a definitive answer. One genealogist, who has spent years examining these reports, noted that her own estimate showed a substantial Scottish component, despite an extensively documented paper trail that never produced a single Scottish ancestor, a discrepancy she attributed to the simple fact that DNA does not respect modern political borders, and people from regions near the England-Scotland border often carry genetic markers shared across both populations. This is a genuinely important caveat, and it means an ethnicity estimate should be read as a starting clue rather than a conclusion. But when an estimate shows a strong concentration in England, particularly in combination with little or no detectable ancestry from the regions of southern and eastern Europe that produced the great waves of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it is consistent with, though not proof of, a family that arrived in North America, considerably earlier than the Ellis Island era, simply because there was no other major wave of English immigration to the United States after the colonial and early federal periods that would otherwise explain the result. The second sign moves out of genetics entirely and into something almost anyone can check without spending $1 on a DNA test: the surname itself, and specifically whether it shows up in the substantial body of compiled colonial genealogies that genealogical societies and archives have spent more than a century assembling. Collections such as compiled genealogies covering the original 13 colonies between 1607 and 1775, and the extensive records maintained by organizations like the New England Historic Genealogical Society, exist specifically because earlier generations of researchers recognized that colonial surnames cluster in identifiable, traceable patterns tied to specific settlements, specific waves of immigration, and specific religious or ethnic communities. The Great Migration Study Project, for instance, is specifically built around profiling the roughly 20,000 English colonists who settled in New England between 1620 and 1640. And a surname's appearance in that specific data set, in that specific window of decades, is a genuinely meaningful clue rather than a coincidence, because the population of English colonists in New England during those 2 decades was small enough that the surnames involved are well cataloged and far from generic. A surname's significance is not just about whether it appears at all, but about where and when it clusters. A name with deep documented roots concentrated in 17th century Massachusetts or on Connecticut town records tells a different story than the same surname showing up, primarily in 19th century immigration records from a major port of entry. New England town records are among the oldest and most extensive colonial genealogy record sets that survive, which means a family surname with deep documented roots, specifically in early Massachusetts. Connecticut, or Rhode Island town registers, is a meaningfully different kind of clue than the same surname appearing for the first time in a 19th century immigration record. The depth and the specific regional pattern matter as much as the name itself. The third sign is one that genealogists who specialize in this period describe almost universally as the single most useful starting point for distinguishing a colonial descended family from a more recently arrived one: the presence, anywhere in family lore or family documentation, of a connection, real or rumored, to specific founding events and institutions that essentially did not exist for later immigrants. The Mayflower's 1620 landing is the most famous example, but it is far from the only one. Today, more than 35 million living Americans can trace their ancestry back to the passengers of that single ship, which is a genuinely enormous number when you consider that it traces back to slightly more than 100 individuals 4 centuries ago. If your family has ever mentioned a connection to the Mayflower, to the founding of Jamestown, to the early Puritan migration into Massachusetts Bay, or to early Quaker settlement in Pennsylvania under William Penn, that is a thread worth pulling. Not because family lore is reliable on its own, but because family lore of this specific, institutionally anchored kind tends to survive in families precisely because it was, at some point, documented and passed down deliberately, often through formal lineage societies built for exactly that purpose. It is also worth noting that not every colonial founding story involves the celebrated, well-known events. Some of the most genealogically productive family legends are the quieter ones. A vague memory of an ancestor who came over as a servant, for instance, rather than as a free settler with means. Indentured servitude was an enormous and historically underappreciated channel of colonial immigration, and entire reference works, including detailed multi-volume compilations of immigrants who arrived in bondage between the early 1600s and the late 1700s, exist specifically to document this population. A family memory of an ancestor who arrived poor, indebted, or under contract is not a less promising lead than a memory of a wealthy founding settler. If anything, it can be a more specific and more traceable one, because indentured servitude generated its own distinct category of court and contract records that researchers have spent decades cataloging. This connects directly to the fourth sign, which is more structural than anecdotal. Whether your family has any documented or rumored eligibility for membership in one of the hereditary lineage societies that exist specifically to verify descent from people who were present in America during the colonial and revolutionary periods. Organizations such as the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, the General Society of Mayflower Descendants, and the Jamestown Society do not admit members on the basis of family stories. They require documented source-by-source proof of an unbroken line of descent, verified by professional genealogists, trained specifically to the admission standards those societies maintain. Professional genealogists, specializing in colonial research, note that they regularly assist clients specifically trying to determine whether they descend from Mayflower passengers, Revolutionary War, veterans, or 17th century settlers, and many are specifically trained to produce documentation suitable for submission to exactly these lineage societies. If an older relative was ever a member of the DAR, the SAR, a Mayflower Society chapter, or similar organization, or if family lore claims eligibility that was simply never formally pursued, that is not idle trivia. It typically means that at some point a real researcher sat down with real records and found a documented chain stretching back to the colonial period, even if the rest of the family never saw the paperwork. The fifth sign requires looking specifically at where, geographically, your earliest known American ancestors actually lived, because the colonial period was not a single, undifferentiated migration. It was a series of distinct settlement waves, each with its own point of origin, its own religious character, and its own surviving record types. Reference records compiled across the original 13 colonies show that Massachusetts holds the distinction of having the earliest surviving church, land, and court. Records of any colony with documentation in all three categories beginning as early as 1620, which means a family with deep roots specifically in early Massachusetts has an unusually good chance of having a discoverable paper trail extending all the way back to initial settlement, simply because the records survived where records in other regions did not. Virginia's earliest plantations along the James River, Pennsylvania's Quaker and German settlements organized around William Penn's colony, the Dutch communities of the Hudson Valley, what became New York and New Jersey, and the Catholic settlements of early Maryland each left their own distinctive record trails and a family history that can be anchored to one of these specific regional founding populations, rather than simply to a vague sense of early America, is a family history with real documentary traction. Within those settlement regions, particular religious traditions kept exceptionally good records, precisely because the institutions themselves value documentation as a form of community accountability. The Society of Friends, popularly known as the Quakers, kept detailed meeting records that are especially valuable to researchers working in Pennsylvania, and the Dutch Reformed Church, most prominent in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, was similarly an early adopter of meticulous record-keeping practices. If your family's earliest known American religious affiliation was Quaker, Dutch Reformed, Puritan, Congregationalist in early New England, or early Catholic in Maryland, you are looking at exactly the kind of institutional record-keeping tradition that makes colonial-era research dramatically more tractable than it would be otherwise, which is itself a sign worth taking seriously, because these are specifically colonial-era religious communities rather than later immigrant congregations. The southern colonies present a somewhat different picture, and recognizing that difference is itself useful. Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia did not generally maintain the same kind of centralized town and church vital records that New England produced, in part because settlement there was organized around scattered plantations rather than tightly clustered towns built around a meeting house. Researchers working on southern colonial lines lean much more heavily on land grants, county court minute books, and parish vestry records, and they often have to contend with the additional complication of burned counties. Virginia counties whose courthouse records were destroyed by fire, flood, or wartime action, sometimes erasing decades of documentation in a single event. If your family's earliest known American roots are specifically Southern rather than New England, that does not make a colonial connection any less plausible. The Southern colonies absorbed just as many early English settlers as the North did, but it does mean the seventh sign discussed below, surviving fragments of land or court records, carries even more weight, since the alternative record types that substitute for missing vital records in the South are narrower than in New England. The sixth sign is subtler and depends on close attention to the specific naming patterns and family structures that show up in whatever fragments of early documentation your family does possess. Christening records, family Bibles, gravestones, old letters. Colonial-era English and New England families followed. Naming conventions that differ in recognizable ways from later immigration-era patterns. The repetition of specific given names across multiple generations, honoring grandparents and great-grandparents. The use of maternal maiden names as middle names to preserve a mother's family line in the historical record. And the practice of naming a child after an older sibling who died in infancy. A grimly common, but genealogically very useful pattern given the era's child mortality rates. Genealogists researching this period consistently note that one of the most persistent and difficult problems in colonial research is establishing a female ancestor's maiden name, precisely. Because so many records from the period identify women only by their married name or first name. Genealogists researching this period describe the identity of an ancestor's mother and father, especially the mother's maiden name, as one of the most persistent and difficult problems in colonial genealogy, often requiring intensive cluster research, using the records of the broader community rather than the individual family alone. If your family tree has a documented brick wall of exactly this specific shape, a male line that traces back cleanly for several generations before suddenly running into an unidentified maiden name in the late 1600s or early 1700s, that particular pattern of difficulty is itself a meaningful sign, because it is the characteristic shape colonial research takes, as opposed to the different kinds of brick walls that show up in later immigration research, which tend to center on an unknown port of departure or an unrecorded ship rather than an unknown maiden name. The seventh and final sign is the existence, anywhere in the family's surviving documentation, of land records, probate records, or court records dating to the colonial period itself. Because these three record types, more than any others, are what colonial genealogists actually rely on in the near total absence of the vital records and federal censuses that make later genealogy comparatively straightforward. Civil registration of births, marriages, and deaths did not become widespread in America until the late 1800s and early 1900s, and federal censuses did not begin until 1790 and did not even name individual household members other than the head of household until 1850, which means that for the entire colonial period, the documentary record that exists is built almost entirely out of land transactions, probated wills and estate inventories, and the minutes of local courts handling everything from property disputes to minor criminal matters. Probate records, deeds, and court records are repeatedly identified by professional genealogists as the essential alternative sources for this period, precisely because the conventional vital and census records modern researchers depend on for later centuries simply do not exist yet. If an old family Bible, a box of inherited papers, or a relative's research notes contains references to a deed, a will, or a court, appearance dated before 1790, even a single one, even a fragment, even just a name and a county, that is not a minor curiosity. It is precisely the kind of primary source thread that professional colonial genealogists build entire confirmed lineages around, because it places a specific named individual in a specific place at a specific datable moment, which is exactly the anchor point colonial research is built to extend outward from in both directions. None of these 7 signs, considered in isolation, is conclusive. A DNA test showing strong English ancestry could just as easily reflect a great-grandparent who arrived from Liverpool in 1910 as a Puritan ancestor who arrived on a ship from Plymouth in 1635. The genetic signature alone cannot fully distinguish between the two without the supporting documentary evidence to anchor a specific time frame. A surname's appearance in a colonial-era record collection could be coincidental if the name is common enough, which is exactly why genealogists emphasize the importance of confirming a documented, unbroken line of descent, rather than simply finding someone who shares your surname in an old record book. Family lore about a Mayflower ancestor is, by itself, exactly that. Lore, until a paper trail confirms it. The genealogical and historical record contains no shortage of confidently repeated family legends that turned out, on closer examination, to be wishful misattribution rather than documented fact. But taken together, a DNA profile consistent with deep English or other colonial source ancestry, a surname with documented roots in a specific early settlement, a family memory of a founding era connection, a rumored or confirmed lineage society, eligibility, a traceable line back to one of the specific colonial settlement regions with strong surviving records, a brick wall in the family tree with the characteristic shape of a colonial era maiden name problem, and any surviving fragment of pre-1790 land, probate, or court documentation. These 7 signs form exactly the convergent pattern that professional genealogists look for when they take on a client's case and begin to suspect, often correctly, that there is a real and documentable colonial lineage waiting underneath the family stories. The research required to confirm it is not quick, and it is rarely simple. Colonial genealogy is, by the near universal agreement of everyone who practices it professionally, one of the more demanding branches of family history research, precisely because the comfortable, Records of later centuries, census sheets with full household listings, civil birth and death certificates, ship manifests with names and origins clearly recorded, simply do not exist yet for this period, and researchers have to reconstruct lives instead from the scattered, indirect, and frequently incomplete record of land transactions, probated estates, church membership rolls, and town meeting minutes that colonial communities happen to produce and that subsequent centuries happen to preserve. What makes the search worth undertaking, for the people who do pursue it seriously, is not really the abstract satisfaction of an old family rumor finally being confirmed or debunked. It is the fact that it documented. Colonial lineage connects a living person, however many generations removed, to the actual lived experience of the earliest English, Dutch, French, and Scottish communities that built the foundations of what would eventually become the United States, to the specific decisions, hardships, and ordinary daily lives of people who crossed an ocean under sailing conditions modern travelers can barely imagine, who built towns and farms, and churches in a landscape utterly unlike the one they had left, and who, in ways they could not possibly have anticipated, left behind a documentary trail thin enough to be genuinely difficult to follow, but durable enough, after 3 and 4 centuries, to still be there waiting for someone curious enough, patient enough, and persistent enough to go looking for it. For anyone who recognizes 2 or 3 of these signs in their own family and wants to take the next step, the practical path forward generally does not begin with the colonial period itself. It begins, somewhat counterintuitively, by working backward, methodically from the present, generation by generation, using the records that do exist, death certificates, obituaries, marriage records, and the federal censuses that become genuinely useful starting in 1850, until the trail reaches whatever generation first appears in records from the early federal period, roughly the late 1700s to the very early 1800s. That generation becomes the bridge. From there, researchers turn to the specific record types that colonial genealogy actually depends on: probate files and will books, deed and land grant indexes at the county or colony level, and, where they survive, church and meeting records. Genealogical societies, state archives, and the Family Search Library's enormous catalog of digitized and microfilmed colonial era material are the standard starting points. And for families with a serious enough lead, the lineage societies mentioned earlier, the DAR, the SAR, the Mayflower Society, and others, maintain their own extensive internal databases of previously verified lines, which can sometimes shortcut years of original research if an ancestor turns out to have already been documented by someone else's earlier application. None of this happens quickly, and very little of it happens by accident. The colonial period rewards patience in a way that later genealogy, with its abundance of searchable digitized records, often does not require. But for the considerable share of American families who carry, somewhere in their DNA, their surname, their scattered family papers, or their half-remembered stories, a real and traceable connection to the earliest chapters of European settlement in North America, the 7 signs above are less a checklist than an invitation, a way of recognizing that the question was always answerable and that the answer, when it finally surfaces from a deed book or a parish register 3 centuries old, tends to be more specific, more human, and more quietly remarkable than the family legend ever was.